Hey guys, Brian here. Welcome back to the channel. So a few months ago, if you remember, I checked out this guy right here. This is the Arctic Freezer 7X. It's a small, obviously very compact, and it has pretty solid aesthetics, all with a pretty affordable price tag as well. And overall, I found this cooler to be a pretty solid option for that $24 price that Arctic is requesting. Well, today we have something a little bit different, but almost the same. We have its bigger brother, the Freezer A13X. This is a cooler that takes the design of the Freezer 7X, slaps on an additional heat pipe, a slightly larger fan, and changes up the mounting mechanism. Now, before we get started, I did want to let you guys know that I did receive this from Arctic for this review, but as always, this will not impact my review in any way. All right, so in regards to these two coolers, there's gonna be three main differences between the Freezer 7X and the Freezer A13X. And while this isn't going to be a direct comparison between both coolers, I feel it's really important to compare them throughout this video because they're nearly identical. They're made by the same company, and they also kind of both are in the exact same price bracket as well. So very quickly, the A13X has three heat pipes over the two that are going to be on the 7X. It has a 100mm fan over a 92mm fan that's going to be on the 7X, and then it's also going to have a very different installation process, as I mentioned before. Other than that, we basically have a nearly identical design to that of the 7X, and that is going to include the size as well. The A13X measures in with a height of 137mm, a width of 73mm, and a depth of 108.5mm. So basically, this means that this should be able to fit in most cases, including some of the larger ITX cases out there. But as always, make sure you're checking your case's CPU clearance before you go ahead and buy this, just to make sure, again, it's gonna fit your system. Now, on the front of the cooler, we're gonna have our 100mm fan right here that I mentioned earlier. It's gonna be easily removable and attachable as needed for installation and that kind of stuff. It's going to have a shroud for the top of the cooler to provide a better looking aesthetic. And at the center of the shroud, we're gonna have the Arctic logo. On the opposite side of the fan, we're gonna have our fin array. This is gonna have 44 fins, and then at the very bottom, we're gonna have our cold plate that is going to have pre-applied thermal paste out of the box. On this cold plate, we're gonna have three double-sided 6mm heat pipes that extend from beneath it, and this is going to obviously be to pull as much heat away from your CPU as possible. And overall, the build quality of this cooler is pretty solid. This is made of plastic, this is metal, everything else is metal, you know, copper, so forth. As for installation, it does have a few more steps than that of the 7X, but I actually found the installation process to be much easier and a lot less stressful as well. It is also important to note here that there are two different versions of the 13X. We have the A13X here today that we're reviewing, and there's also the i13X. The A13X is for the AMD AM4 sockets only, while the i13X is for a handful of Intel-based sockets. I'll be leaving a link to the product page of both coolers down in the description box below, so you can verify it'll work with your system. Anyway, to start the installation process, you're going to want to remove the black retainers that come standard on your AM4 motherboard. Then go ahead and hold the backplate up against the back of your motherboard and then thread on these double-sided standoffs. There is an offset line on the standoffs, and this is the side that's going to be threaded into your backplate. Once all four are threaded in, go ahead and drop the retainers on, making sure that they bow outwards and the recessed part of the retainers is facing upward. Now all we need to do is thread on the included nuts, tighten them a smidge with a screwdriver, and then we're ready to go ahead and attach the cooler. To do this, go ahead and pull off the fan, then go ahead and remove the plastic cover on the bottom of the cooler, lower the cooler onto the CPU, and tighten the retention screws down. Make sure to start both of the screws first, and then go back and forth until they are completely tightened in order to ensure proper mounting pressure. After that's done, pop the fan back on, plug the fan into the CPU header, and that's it. The A13X is installed. Now let's talk performance. For our testing, I used my typical test bench I use for like all my CPU cooler reviews. This is going to be a bench that has Ryzen 5 3600 clocked at 4.0 gigahertz, 1.2 volts, the MSI B450 Tomahawk Max motherboard, a 16GB kit of 3200 megahertz memory, and then also an MSI GTX 1660 Super. This is like the Gaming X version. Like most of my CPU cooler reviews, I always like to provide you guys noise samples from 30% fan speed to 100% fan speed. Today's no different, and so here's that along with how it sounds under load compared to the Wraith Stealth and Wraith Prism CPU coolers. So acoustically, the A13X is really quiet under load while using the default fan curve of the Tomahawk Max motherboard. It's basically identical to the 7X. It's also substantially quieter than the Wraith Prism and Wraith Stealth stock AMD coolers, which is absolutely awesome, of course. Now, the thing that I found to be a little bit odd with 13X is at 100% fan speed, this cooler is pretty loud. It caps out at about 50 decibels. This is 4 decibels louder than the 7X, and I get that the 7X has like a 92mm fan, and this one has a 100mm fan, but noise and RPM wise, they're like identical, going all the way up to 70%. 70% is the noise normalized for like 40 dB for this right here. Once you get to that point, this one really starts to make a lot more noise and actually starts to spin a bit faster as well. These both are rated between, I think, 300 and 2000 RPM, so theoretically they should be going about the same. This one actually tops out at 2050. This one tops out at about 1950, at least for my testing in particular. I don't know if this one would actually be louder if they both ran at the same RPM. I doubt it, but again, this one was a little bit louder at the high end. If you do grab this cooler, I would highly recommend modifying your fan curve to cap out around 80%. You shouldn't lose much, if any, cooling performance at all, and to me, under 80% fan speed, it's barely noticeable under load. And that's coming from someone who's really picky about noise. Like, I want my system to be as quiet as possible. Now, moving over to cooling performance of the A13X, I was actually quite surprised. Using the default 8-64 stress test with the default fan curve, the A13X just edges out the 7X. And when I say edges out, I mean the average temperature of the A13X was consistently 1.4 degrees Celsius better, while the max temperature was consistently a half a degree Celsius better. This, of course, was surprising to me as the 13X introduced the larger fan as well as the additional heat pipe. I thought we would actually see quite a bit bigger temperature variance than what we got. The story stays about the same for my noise normalized testing, where the A13X's average temperature was consistently about a degree better and the maximum temperature was consistently about 2 degrees Celsius better. Now, me generally thinking that this design was going to perform much better, and after running both of these tests several times, I was really confused, and I was not convinced that the results I was getting for this cooler was accurate at all. And so I decided to overclock my 3600 a little more to 4.2 gigahertz at 1.3 volts, and drumroll please, because this did absolutely nothing for the A13X. At least it didn't do all that much. In this test, both the average and max temperature variance between the coolers were about 2 degrees Celsius. Yes, it was a little bit improved, but it still wasn't the variance I was expecting. I was expecting to see like a 4 or 5 degrees Celsius drop for this cooler, just based on, again, the additional heat pipe. Now, just for reference, I did also test this while gaming, as I typically do, at 4 gigahertz, 1.2 volts. And since less heat is produced while gaming, I expected there would be no variance after seeing the first tests, and that was the result. There was basically no variance between the two models while gaming at all. And again, this is, of course, because there's less heat. If it didn't make a difference when there was a lot of heat, there wasn't going to be much difference when there was even less heat than that. And so, for me, this was kind of a bummer to write, okay? The Freezer 7X can be had for less money, and the performance is nearly identical in most cases to that of the 13X. And if you watch my review of the 7X, I found it was worth a look for those on a tight budget that have limited space within their case and wanted a good performing quiet option. And looking at the A13X, I would find this worth a look for the same reasons if the 7X actually didn't exist and the A13X was priced similarly to that of the 7X. But it's not, and the 7X does exist. And actually comparing the two, I actually prefer the A13X over the Freezer 7X. And that's because I feel the installation process is far better on the A13X than on the 7X for the AMD platform. I didn't emphasize it that much in my review of the 7X because I didn't think it was that big of a deal, but those little hinges, these guys right here, they are a pain to make sure that they're in the right spot. I'm not a big fan of this mounting mechanism, this mounting design. Again, if they would stay still, that'd be a whole different story. I wouldn't care too much. But these are a pain in the butt when it comes to installation process for this cooler. The installation process of the A13X, in my opinion, is far superior than that of the 7X. And so even though this isn't supposed to be a comparison of the two, it kind of has to be because they are like identical twins. You guys can see them right now. They are identical in almost every single way, and they are almost identical in performance, cooling wise and noise wise as well. The 7X is obviously the better buy, as it includes both Intel and AMD mounting hardware. So if you want to switch from one system to another, you can. You don't have to worry, you're not going to be bound bound with this cooler to one platform, and it's also about 15% cheaper for basically no performance loss in most real world scenarios. Again, this will be better in like high heat scenarios, but not by even that much at all. Anyway, thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Be sure to drop a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. And if you have any questions at all, drop them in the comments below, or even maybe consider joining our free community Discord as well, which there are links to in the description box below. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.